Okay, hi everyone, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming, Sharon. It's lovely to see you all here today. And welcome back to seminar 4. So today we're going to be talking about synthesizing evidence. So just a quick recap from last week. Hopefully after the last session, let's put that there. Hopefully after the last session, you now know how to organize your articles, why appraisal is important, and how to find and use different appraisal tools. So today we're going to move on to the next step, which is our synthesis. We are venturing into this woolly and murky world of evidence synthesis. That's how I like to describe it, but other people will probably not. So this is normally the point in a tutorial where the instructor goes, and then you do your analysis, and no more explanation is given. And today I'm hoping we'll go into a little bit more detail than that. So by the end of today, we should be able to understand what is meant by evidence synthesis, have an idea of what is needed for different types of synthesis, and begin to understand coding and the practical steps in synthesis, particularly in qualitative synthesis, which is what we'll be talking about today. So first, what do I mean by evidence synthesis? This is the process of bringing together data from a set of included studies that we've identified in the previous steps to draw conclusions about a body of knowledge. Synthesis is a type of analysis, but these two ideas are different, even if they are often used interchangeably. Analysis is more about breaking information down into its component parts, often to understand what is happening underneath and how those things interact together. When you're analysing something, you're sort of taking it apart to understand how it works. With synthesis, it's about bringing information from various sources together and comparing and contrasting them to draw new conclusions and develop new findings. And this is what we hope to achieve with a literature review. There are lots of different ways to synthesize evidence. You might recognize this diagram, I think, from our first seminar, where we talked about the different types of research. Much like the appraisal tools we talked about last session, the method you use for your synthesis will depend on the data you've collected and what you're trying to achieve with your research. All of the examples listed in this slide are different ways of synthesizing evidence, and each follow a different set of steps or a different recipe, and will aim to achieve different things. I'll give an overview of a few of them before moving on to our chosen method, which is realist synthesis, which I get really excited about. So we'll start with meta-analysis. This is what you'll frequently hear when people are talking about quantitative evidence synthesis. We'll have to see how many times I can say that word this session without tripping up over it, because I do every time. So meta-analysis refers to the statistical combination of results from two or more separate studies. This will often use different statistical tests depending on the type of data that's in the studies you're using. So meta-analysis has many strengths, which can also indicate the areas it should be used for. One strength is in improving precision and estimates of truth, which I took from a textbook. And you might be thinking, what on earth does that mean? And you'll be pleased to know that I thought the exact same thing. I was I didn't quite get that when I first read it. And luckily I had Amy to explain it to me. So I'm going to do a little detour and just into that little explanation. So individual quantitative studies have something called confidence intervals. This is essentially saying we are 95% confident that the truth exists within this gap or this interval or between these points in the data. And how big or how small that gap is will depend on the variables and research methods used in that specific study. Only so many factors can be accounted for in one study or will be accounted for. Therefore, that gap may not be as precise. With a meta-analysis, we're getting together all those individual studies that have taken different variables into account. So if one study says we are 95% confident that the truth exists here based on the variables they've accounted for, and other 2 or 3 studies, other studies account for different variables and say we're confident that the truth exists in these gaps, a meta-analysis brings those together and narrows down that gap and says we are 95% confident that actually it's in this more precise gap that we've identified. It's important when interpreting confidence intervals to think about what it means if the truth is at either extreme end of the gap. So if the truth is right over here at one end, it might have a more worthwhile impact than if the truth was right here at the other end. Where the truth actually sits within this gap determines potentially how worthwhile an intervention might be. So doing a meta-analysis where you can narrow down that gap and narrow down the difference between one end and the other can be really useful and really important at adding precision to whether or not that intervention is worthwhile. So that's what we mean by improved precision. It might have been a bit of a detour, but I thought it was quite useful. So meta-analysis can be really helpful in answering other questions. Individual studies often involve a specific group of participants and explicitly defined interventions. Reviewing a selection of studies where these characteristics are different, but the same kind of measures are collected can answer additional questions. And they can also settle conflicts. So sometimes studies might generate conflicting claims. A meta-analysis will allow for the data from these studies to be compared and contrasted and formally assessed with the reasons for different results being explored. Meta-analyses do have a severe limitation in that, I can't get rid of this little laser now. Oh, there we are. Do have a severe limitation in that if specific aspects in the original study, such as study design or within study biases or variables, are not considered, then the resulting meta-analysis won't potentially be as precise, or it might be a bit misleading. Additionally, the method itself can be quite complex and may not be suitable for someone doing their first systematic review unless you have support. There is lots of software that exists to make it fairly simple, like Revman from Cochrane and things like that, but it's always best to have some support if you're doing it for the first time. So what do you need to know? If you're going to do a meta-analysis, there's a few things you need to consider first. You need to think about whether a meta-analysis is appropriate for your synthesis. Things like, are your data sufficiently similar for comparison? If not, then the approach may not be right for your review. You need to be able to identify your summary statistic in your data, and that's the statistic, another word I'll trip over, that you're going to be analysing across your data set. And it needs to be the most appropriate one to answer your research question. You will need to know how to employ statistical tests potentially, and how to use software like R or SPSS, and how to read quantitative data and what all the different terms mean. And you'll see that on the right-hand side of this slide, I've highlighted some key reading. When I put these up online, those links will be clickable. So if you want to go and do some reading on these things, then you'll be able to. But they all give introductory knowledge around meta-analysis, but they often do require you to have some mathematical knowledge beforehand. So if you're conducting a meta-analysis for the first time, I'd recommend you befriend or pay for a statistician to help you on the project. Our next method we'll briefly talk about is qualitative evidence synthesis. Our next method of qualitative evidence synthesis, is framework analysis. So this method involves using a theory or a framework to guide data analysis and interpretation. When I say framework or theory, this just refers to a lens through which you will view each study's findings. So for example, I might choose a theory of social inequality to look at studies reporting on the experiences of different ethnic groups in accessing mental health support. The theory I've chosen might not exist explicitly in that data. However, that's the lens I will look through when I view the data. And this will then result in a different interpretation from the original study findings and a different interpretation to if I chose a theory of, say, social identity. The only thing to consider here is that the theory or framework you choose will probably need to be included in your original research question. So framework analysis can be particularly useful in its flexibility. As you get to select your theory or your framework or model based on what you're trying to investigate, there's a lot of scope to adapt theories to your specific review, and it's also a good method for new qualitative researchers to use and suitable for novices. The focus on one theory or framework over another can obviously limit the scope of the insights that arise from your review. despite being flexible to implement, it's still a very structured approach, as the data must be viewed from the specific scaffold or framework chosen. So with my above example, if I chose to use a theory of social identity to look at experiences of different ethnic groups in accessing mental health support, insights related to the impact of social inequalities such as discrimination might be missed. This doesn't mean that the review's finding is any less valid, just that it doesn't necessarily reflect the whole picture. So there are key steps to framework synthesis. You need to have an a priori framework, which just means something that's based on theory rather than empirical evidence, and something that exists before your analysis. And you must have an understanding of each of the steps. So you need to have an understanding of a priori reasoning. You need to read through and develop a good understanding of the stages involved. And you also need to think about reflexivity and positionality, which I'll talk about very briefly. So this just means thinking about the impact your own experiences and worldview have on the interpretation of data. They can be complex concepts to explain, but I like to think about it like this. So as a qualitative researcher, I believe that the world can be experienced and looked at in different ways. If you're looking at this object from this point of view, you might just see an ovoid shape. Whereas if you're looking at it from here, you might see a rectangle. The experience and understanding of this object that you have changes depending on the position from which you look at it. And this is roughly what we mean when we talk about positionality. Reflexivity is the practice of examining how the position from which you view things impacts your understanding of the world. My positionality and assumptions about the world will impact the conclusions I draw and the interpretations I make when examining data. And reflexivity is the critical process of identifying and examining those assumptions. People have written entire books on this subject, so my summary does not do it justice at all, but that's the gist.
Again, consumed mostly in the same high income.
Again, you can see I've put some key reading along the side here, and they're all open access, I believe, but this one here is it is open access, but you will need to create an account to access it if you want to. So we'll talk quickly about meta-aggregation, which is another qualitative evidence synthesis. So you may have noticed when we were talking about framework analysis, there was a lot of focus on reinterpreting the findings of your included studies, which is a cross between true synthesis and analysis. And this is quite common with qualitative methods. And it's a way they differ significantly from quantitative methods. Meta-aggregation tries to bridge that gap and seeks to aggregate or gather into a single entity all of the qualitative findings included in your review. This is one of the strengths of the method. The original findings are not reinterpreted or adapted particularly. Instead, they're sort of authentically and accurately represented as intended by the original authors. And much like quantitative approaches, meta-aggregation requires you to develop your protocol in advance and follow it to the letter, which you should be able to do if you sort of follow these seminars, because they're roughly telling you what a protocol should include and the things you should think about. So the problem with reporting findings exactly as they are is that there may well be methodological concerns around those findings or the study. So when last week, when we were talking about critical appraisal, in a meta-aggregative, I can't say that either, meta-aggregative review, that sounds wrong, we'll go with it. Critical appraisal becomes really important because how those methodological concerns or so on impacted the findings will need to be addressed in the review. So again, what do we need to know? We need to know roughly how to read qualitative data and how to understand the themes that are presented in the articles you're reading. You'll need to be able to identify their relevance to each other and your review question. You'll need to have a really good understanding of theory relating to the area you're reviewing. For example, if you're looking at strategies to support individuals dealing with addiction, you need to understand some of the social issues and theories relating to addiction to be able to contextualize the themes within those studies. You need to know how to critically appraise studies. Luckily, I might know some seminars on that. And you also need to be able to understand the stages of a literature review and how to implement them. Okay, we're on to our chosen method of realist synthesis, which I'm going to do a really whistle-stop tour of. It's specifically used for looking at complex health or social care interventions or programs, which is what we call them within realist methods. I will try not to use too much jargon, but I might slip up at times. So one of the strengths of this method is that it seeks to explain. This method wants to come out of the review and say, this works because of X, Y, Z. And not only does it seek to explain, it wants to dig out the things that traditional research methods might miss through sort of continuous inclusion of stakeholders and who have experience of the programme or the intervention. Stakeholders just means relevant people. If I was researching dog owners' strategies for giving dogs their medication, then my stakeholder group might be dog owners and vets. The progress of the synthesis is continually fed back to the stakeholders to see if it matches their understanding, their experience, and if it makes sense to them. One of the biggest limitations of this method is that it can be quite messy. And by messy, I don't mean physical mess. It's just quite abstract and theoretical and conceptual. So it can be quite complex and often requires a lot of training. And there's also a lot of method-specific language that can be very off-putting, which you can see listed in the key concepts box. So a quickish introduction. I said we talk about programme, which is a health or social care intervention. And we talk about programme architecture, which just means anything about that programme that sort of happens to deliver the programme. So an example might be this seminar series is a programme, and the programme architecture will be things like being delivered online, being recorded, how it's advertised, who it's delivered by. They're all part of the programme architecture. And then we have the programme theory. This is just a theory of how the programme works or is intended to work. We'd start with an initial programme theory, which is really our best guess based on experience, literature, and chatting to stakeholders. And over the course of the synthesis, we use evidence to clarify this into a refined programme theory, which is then an evidence-based explanation of how and why an intervention works. So a programme theory is generally a CMO configuration, which means context, mechanism, and outcome. So by context, we mean anything that impacts how the programme is enacted. This could be social features, things like location, anything that affects implementation, characteristics of staff or service users, funding, policy. The list is really endless. Mechanism is quite slippery to define. It's even with lots of people that do a realist synthesis, they'll probably all give you a slightly different definition of what mechanism means. But it normally consists of two parts. So it's the resource and the response. The resource is the context as perceived by the individual, and the response is the emotional or cognitive process that happens in response to that resource. This is often invisible and something we can't actually see. And then the outcome is the visible, measurable outcome of the programme. So it can be unexpected and unintended, but generally they're things like health outcomes or improved quality of life. Altogether, this is a CMO configuration or a programme theory. So let's give an example. We always assume in realist methodology that the programme works, and what we're looking for is to explain how it works or how it would work. So our programme says the seminar series. So our context might be something like the seminar being delivered by someone who is relatable and with minimal jargon. This doesn't have to be explicitly true. We're just saying that if this happens, then something else will happen. And I would love to think that I'm relatable and have managed to keep most jargon out, but to be fair, looking at the last few slides, I'm not sure I have, but I don't know this to be the case. My best guess at the mechanism would look something like this, the resource being accessible information about social research methods that is non-threatening and ideally not intimidating. And the response to this resource is that the attendees understand the information and feel confident in their understanding. Again, I don't know this to be true, but this is what I think and expect to happen when this specific context is in play. Finally, our outcome might be that if this context is in play and if this mechanism is accurate, then attendees will be able to apply that knowledge to practical situations. So this altogether is an initial program theory, which is an idea based on my experience of training and being trained that I'm hoping explains how this program might achieve the desired outcome. In reality, these initial program theories will be based on a lot more. This is just an example I've made up. And when we're doing a realist synthesis, we're hoping to identify specific CMOs like this that explain why and how something does or does not work. I would start with something like this and then use literature I've gathered to test that CMO. Is there evidence to support it, or is there something else entirely going on? Now, we all know by now that I like my pretty diagrams, and that's the way my brain works, to have things laid out and lovely with arrows everywhere. But obviously that's not always the case. And if you'd rather write things down and you want to do sort of realist inspired methods, then you can do it as if, then, and because. And that would just say something like, if the seminars are free of jargon and delivered by someone relatable to the target audience, then attendees will become able to think about applying that information to their own practice, because attendees understand the information and will feel confident in their understanding. So once we've completed our synthesis and we've refined this theory that if this is the context, then this is the outcome because of this mechanism, you might think, well, why is that a useful thing to do? And it's useful because it identifies the practical steps we can take to support the best possible environment for that program to succeed. So we can say that if you're trying to deliver a seminar like this, then you need to make sure the jargon is minimal. You need to be relatable. You need to encourage confidence and understanding, etc. And we can give some practical recommendations about how you can do that. So again, a little summary and some key reading on the side, which I believe are, again, mostly open access. And then finally, we'll go on to our research project. And I know this is a lot of background before we actually get to the analysis. So you may or may not remember our research question is around what contextual factors and mechanisms support collaborative social care services to achieve preferred outcomes for older adults. And you might be able to see now that we've formulated this question with realist synthesis in mind, because we're looking at factors and mechanisms and outcomes. And when we started, I developed some initial program theories based on chatting to various people, shadowing, reading literature and other people's experiences. They were all really non-specific and vague. And obviously you can see I love my diagrams. So our initial program theory is really important for our analysis. These are all of our vague ideas, and we're going to look for evidence for or against in the literature. And in realist synthesis, we use these initial program theories to build a coding structure before we start our analysis. So now we've done our crash course, we can start talking about coding. So coding is just organizing and labeling your data based on the content. So if we take this passage here from an article that's been included in our review, coding means looking at this paragraph and picking out what the topics are and what it's saying. I might look at this highlighted section and say, okay, well, this is talking about lack of understanding. And that might be my first code, lack of understanding. I might also think this is talking about non-integrated teams or mental health. That one excerpt can have lots of different codes that identify and describe what that content is. Doing it on a large scale normally requires some kind of software, something like NVivo, which is what I have been using for our project and will show you as we go on. You can just do this in Excel if you put your codes as headings and then copy and paste the excerpts and the text just below them. And that way you just organize your text under the codes. If you're developing codes from the content, then you will end up with hundreds and hundreds of codes. The list will evolve over time and you will rearrange them as you begin to make sense of the themes or groups of codes that you put under a single heading. So as I said, for this project, I'm using NVivo. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to use NVivo itself. We'd be here for days, and there's so many really, really, really good YouTube tutorials that if you do want to look into a bit more, just type into YouTube NVivo for beginners and lots of results will come up. But NVivo is a piece of software that allows you to highlight code, compare, organize, and make notes on qualitative data. So I've uploaded all of the PDFs of the articles that are included in our review. What you can see here is the pre-developed coding structure that's based on the initial program theory. I've separated out into context, mechanism, and outcome, and then I've put codes from the initial program theory under each of those headings. What I'm now going to do is look through the articles and see what they say about those program theories and identify other factors that may be relevant that I probably hadn't considered beforehand. And when I come across a relevant excerpt, I just highlight it, right-click, and select the appropriate code. So this coding structure is just a start and just an example of what it would look like when you started. I'm currently about a quarter of the way through our data, and this, I think I had 106 codes when I did these seminars, so it will have gone up a lot more since then. Much like when we began our literature search, it gets a lot worse before it gets better. Whenever I come across a new piece of information that doesn't quite fit under an existing code, I'll add a new one that describes that content of that specific excerpt. And I might code one excerpt with multiple codes. How you organize your data, your codes will depend on your own personal preference or what you've agreed with your team. You'll see before that, you'll see here, I've nested codes under other codes. So for example, here we've got honesty and sharing information both under communication, which is nested under outcomes for team members. Eventually, over time, the codes will be refined and rearranged until they represent specific CMO configurations. And the process of refining these takes time and is really difficult to explain, which is why I think a lot of people tend to avoid it. For me, every time I add a new code, I first spend time going through the existing codes and trying to verbalize why the excerpt in front of me does or does not fit. So let's have an example. If we look at this excerpt from another study included in our review, this excerpt says that trust is needed for practitioners to effectively develop relationships. And this trust in this particular article stems from empathy and understanding of each other's perspectives and responsibilities. So I read this, and my key takeaway is that this excerpt's content is about relationships, and it's about trust, efficacy, understanding of role, understanding of difficulties of colleagues, but it's primarily about relationships. And looking at my outcomes for team members, I don't actually have a code for relationships on there, but I do have a code for relationships somewhere else, but just not as an outcome. So then I'm asking myself, well, what is different in this content that's in front of me about relationships compared to the content that I've previously coded elsewhere under relationships? So I can go to my existing relationships code and click on it, and it shows me what the excerpts I've previously coded there. I can see that this one here is actually more about using relationships to bypass formal procedures rather than relationships themselves. So because of that, I create a new code under outcomes and resources and processes, and then bypassing formal procedures. And then I can see that this other excerpt here is more about skipping the small talk and using a pre-existing relationship to communicate frankly and efficiently when organizing appropriate support for someone. So I recode this under outcomes, communication, honesty, and then add a new code, efficiency. So I go back to my excerpt, and I'm still not sure that my original excerpt fits under descriptor relationship where it was initially nested. So it's saying that this excerpt is saying that the effective interprofessional relationship is an outcome of trust, empathy, and understanding, and so on. And having reviewed the remaining excerpts under the relationship code, I can now see that actually the other bits of data there are talking also about relationship being an outcome, whereas the ones I've recoded are talking about a relationship being a mechanism to achieve something else. So all I do is I drag and drop Hopefully it will play, but it's probably not going to. No. That should be a lovely little video showing me dragging and dropping it, but it's not going to work. So all you do when I'm in Vivo is I just click on that relationships code and I dragged and dropped it down into outcomes for team members. So as you can tell, this entire process takes quite a long time and is very involved. And so far, what I've described is the same as what I'd expect for really any type of qualitative analysis. This is the process of coding. The difference in a realist synthesis is what I'm looking to produce in the end. So because the intended outcome from this work is to be able to say, this is how this works in this specific situation, my next step is to verbally or visually represent the idea that trust and empathy are a mechanism for developing effective interprofessional relationships within integrated teams. So I go back to my CMO configurations. Again, love my diagrams, so I do this in diagram form, and other people might do this differently. I don't know what the context is yet. I don't have the evidence for that, and I haven't defined it, so I'm going to leave that blank. And I don't know what the resource is. But I can see that based on this article, trust and empathy is the response to something that then results in an effective interprofessional relationship. So I fill in the bits I know to fill in. And remember this, if you're not doing a realist synthesis, then you don't need to do this in your analysis. I add this to NVivo and I classify it as a CMO. And you can see that I've added that this is the first iteration of this specific CMO. And I put it under a heading of relationships because I vaguely know, I know this is vaguely about relationships at the minute. The other thing that's great about NVivo is that you can add relationships between each file. So to track my articles and the development of CMOs, I then create a record of the relationship between the article I've just coded and the rough attempt at a CMO I've created. I can add relationships between codes and CMOs, and over time, these become more and more refined and evidence-based. So if I continue reading another article tomorrow or something that's included in the review, and I find evidence of what the context that, that creates trust and empathy might be, then I can then create a new CMO diagram, link it to the article and the existing CMO, and then be able to track the development of each CMO and what evidence has been used for it. And again, remember, you don't have to code and develop diagrams like this if you're not doing a realist synthesis. But it is a really good idea to track or to find a way to keep track of your thinking and how your themes are developing. This is particularly important because regardless of the type of analysis you are using, when you're reporting your findings, which we'll talk about in the next seminar, it's important to be able to fully explain how you reached your findings, being able to support each iteration of your thinking and findings with the data, in this case, the literature, will help justify your conclusion and provide the evidence base. You'll be able to say, I've come to this conclusion because of these pieces of evidence. Also, it can be really hard to take ideas from your brain and solidify them into findings and put those into words. Often, particularly in health and social care, you'll be thinking of concepts and abstract ideas or feelings, and putting those into words can be really, really difficult, but you will need to at some point. So spending time clarifying just for yourself exactly what you're thinking and what you don't know or what the gaps are will help to develop what you're thinking and how you understand those concepts. This way, when you're presenting your findings as well, and someone doesn't quite understand them, you can start right at the beginning and take them through the steps of how that finding developed. So there's some other ways you can find new insights into your data in NVivo, and these will be the same for all qualitative analysis. Once you've coded your data, you can use tools to sort of compare and contrast the data you've created, you've coded. So I like to create a cluster diagram, and this identifies and groups coded data based on the similarity of words in each coded excerpt, or based on the document they appear in, or based on so you can decide what it's based on. And if I look at this cluster diagram, then this tells me that the data in civic responsibility and significance use a lot of the same words. And my job is to then investigate that and go, are these codes related? Is a feeling of civic responsibility related to feeling as though one's role is meaningful and significant? Doing it this way can help you identify new relationships that you hadn't thought about before. So I can also see that power balance and supported use a lot of the same words, which together are similar to managing expectations just above there. And perhaps managing expectations equalizes the power balance within the team, and this somehow relates to the idea of feeling supported. This could be an insight idea to investigate and then go look and see if there's more evidence of that. But because I may not have thought about that without this cluster diagram. And it's worth noting here that when I was writing these seminars, I went down so many rabbit holes because I was playing around with the cluster diagrams, and it made me think of things that I hadn't considered before. So this took a little bit longer than I was expecting. So the next step when there's a connection or idea that you haven't considered is to do two things. And firstly, you want to look at existing literature or evidence and see if there's a theory that already exists that explains the connection between those 2 points. And if there isn't, can you articulate what you think is going on in your data and try to develop your own? And then you need to think and evaluate whether that theory matches the data that's in front of you, and how well does that theory explain what's in your data? Is there anything that's not explained? And are you satisfied with the level of explanation? So once you've got your codes and you've narrowed your codes down, you will have vague ideas about how they fit together. You find your theory or theories that explain the concept or mechanism or link or theme, and then you ask yourself, what does this theory explain and what is the explanation? And is there anything not explained or not accounted for? And then you need to think, am I satisfied with the level of explanation? If yes, that's great. You might have your first finding. However, you need to be able to explain why you're satisfied. Sometimes something can logically make sense, but once you try to put it into words and explain that, then it might start to come apart a little bit, and you might have this niggling little feeling that it doesn't quite fit. Explaining why you think it fits can help identify those gaps or solidify them. If you're not satisfied with the level of explanation, then we go back to the beginning and we find or create a theory or theories that explain that thing that isn't quite being explained by the literature and the theories that already exist. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important in qualitative research to be aware of how positionality and your own personal views and experiences will impact your interpretation of research. So going back to this slide where I talked about, say, power balance and feeling supported, and I said, well, perhaps managing expectations equalizes this power balance and things like that. That connection between those 2 points might just be based on my experience and my views on the world. So perhaps I've had an experience where I expected to feel equal, but was actually in a position where other people on my team were in a more powerful position, and therefore I didn't feel supported. And that one experience might influence the connection I'm making between these 2 codes. It might influence whether I think that's a positive or a negative connection. It might influence my interpretation of the data that's in front of me. So to manage this, I keep notes on why I'm making that connection and what I think that connection means. This can be in the form of a reflective diary, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a little notebook that sits next to me and comes everywhere with me, where I make almost constant notes. You also need to have an awareness and understanding of how your own experiences might influence your thoughts and actions. However, you can only be so aware, and this is where a team is really helpful. Your team can be a variety of people. They can be academic supervisors, an informal or formal mentor, stakeholders, a formal steering committee, a group of patient and public involvement members, or other researchers involved on the project. But talking about your analysis to this group or your support network or your team, to gain their insights and to have some critiques of your thought processes is crucial. this group is something that you often need to plan from the early stages of your project, whether it's informally asking someone if they're happy for you to bounce ideas off them, or formally setting up a group that you agree to meet with at regular intervals. And this will really enhance your analysis and increase its rigor and validity. So that was a lot. It's quite a difficult topic to talk about, but quite interesting and fun, I tend to think. So hopefully you now have an idea of what we mean by evidence synthesis, about bringing data together from different included studies. You've got an idea of what's needed for different types of evidence synthesis. So we talked about meta-analysis, framework analysis, meta-aggregation, and a tiny, tiny bit of realist synthesis. And you can begin to understand the practical steps in coding and the practical steps in synthesis. So things like labeling the data based on content and how you might compare and contrast them, and how you might apply theory and the importance of reflexivity, positionality, and teams. Next time, we will talk about presenting your findings and reporting your findings, and then assessing the overall quality. And then finally, in our last session, we'll talk about the different ways you can disseminate your findings and make sure they have an impact, because we all want to do research that has some kind of practical impact. So there is, I think, about 3 pages of references now, which I will leave up for a second each, which of course will all be on the documents I upload after this. For now, that's the end of the seminar. Does anyone have any questions at all or any comments? I'm not seeing anything so far. So if no one has any comments to make, then I'm more than happy for you guys to head off, and thank you so much for coming, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you, Fran. And
thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll stop this recording now.